A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U.
Sing the Happy Friday song.
I don't know the Happy Friday song. What's the Happy Friday song?
I don't know either.
You're just making this stuff up as you go along.
As I go.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P. How's that?
Yeah, I think we'll get started. Ron's probably coming up the elevator any minute now, so I'd like to bring the executive committee to order and make sure we have a quorum. We do, I think.
You do?
And we will go for item number 1, which is approval of the meeting minutes. Move from Wood. Second.
Sure.
Thank you.
Mr. Acting Chair, I think that actually you're an alternate right now since you're here.
First time I forgot. Thank you.
I move approval.
Second.
Todd, second. All those in favor say aye. Aye.
Man, this is the one.
Oh, we gotta do this.
Make everything irregular. Not a chance.
Vote's closed. There we go. Thank you very much. Item number 2, public comments. Are there any individuals who have some comments from the public? I don't see any. And we'll go to item number 3, consent calendar and the legislative status report, Victoria and Robin. On the consent, anything? Okay. We are going to, because of the topic, we're going to move item number 4 to the end of the agenda and go to item number 5, the preliminary 2017 program budget, and Tim.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
So we're in the process of developing the fiscal year 2017 program budget. It's well underway at this point. So today I want to bring you a quick status report summarizing where we are with the overall objectives, as well as defining the scope of the overall work program, the operational activities, and the funding to support these efforts. The capital program highlights will be included next month in the March draft. So the annual budget development starts by updating the agency's strategic goals and areas of emphasis, which are described in attachment 1, shown on page 6 of this report, or page 30 in the tablets. So these short and long-term strategies provide overarching guidance to prioritize the competing efforts and to arrive at a balance between an achievable work plan and all reasonably available funding. Staff is finalizing the funding, and we're confident that a balanced budget will be achieved with the federally required draft budget document by early March. The currently proposed work plan elements are described in attachment 2 on page 8 of your report and page 32 of your tablets, which shows a listing of project objective statements for each project and includes those activities that will be emphasized in FY 2017. The current funding environment is similar to the last couple of years for the OWP, with more moderate sales tax revenue growth of approximately 3.5%, and federal and state planning fund levels projected to remain flat over the fiscal year. Staff is optimistic that the new FAST Act appropriations will provide increases in key planning funds of up to 5%. However, until the actual allocations show up in the Federal Register, we're not counting on them. Revenues from operations are expected to grow by 4 to 5%, driven by I-15 and SR-125 revenues. For highlights of next year's planning and operations programs, we have the continuing implementation of San Diego Forward, the regional plan, including more detailed technical analysis and studies, environmental studies of the new rail segment alignments, and advancing active transportation improvements. We'll be actively continuing outreach programs to inform the public about projects included in the regional plan, existing Transnet measures, and a potential new regional funding measure. Further enhancements to our state-of-the-art transportation models, including an update to the demographic, economic, and forecasting model, and implementation of the 3D Space Corps land inventory system. Also continued development of comprehensive update study of the impacts of border delays, including economic and climate change impacts of the congestion at the border. We'll be completing a regional mobility hub study, which focuses on integrated suite of transportation services supporting amenities and urban design enhancements that bridge that distance between transit centers and individual origins and destinations. And we'll be advancing regional transportation demand management studies, TDM strategies, as identified in the regional plan, including an expansion of shared mobility services and increasing participation in the regional van pool program. For regional operations, plans coming to fruition include implementing plans for a centralized back office tolling system for I-15 and SR 125, and deploying additional ARGIS enhancements in member agency connectivity and disaster recovery. As for next steps, the SANDAG staff will be working with regional and federal funding agencies over the next month to assure alignment of SANDAG priorities with federal planning fund priorities. We'll return to this committee in March with a draft FY 2017 program budget, including a capital program, seeking authorization to distribute the documents to funding agencies for their review, and recommend acceptance of the draft by the board at the March 25th meeting. Staff will return again in May with the proposed final budget, seeking your recommendation to the board for approval at the May 27th board meeting. Thank you for your consideration and comments regarding these budget proposals, and staff is happy to address any questions you may have.
Any questions for staff, discussion? Mary?
Two quick questions. One pertains to the level of detail we'll see in ARGIS as to what some of their projects are, and also the status of the MOU as that may impact what we're willing to do in terms of ARGIS's proposals for next year. And that's not a question, that's just what I would like to see. And secondly, and this may be totally random, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. When do we start looking at, if the ballot initiative does not pass, this is going to change radically, is that a fair statement? At what point in time do we, as a board, start looking at next steps? Is that 2 years from now? Is that 4 years from now?
So Mayor, I think the thought is, look, if the board decides to go, then obviously we won't know whether we've been successful till November or not. So I think this next year's budget is built with the idea, or at least it's being proposed to be built with the idea that if we go, there's a bunch of work. But about the same time, we need to start planning for the next update of the RTP. And we just adopted one. We've got to redo it every 4 years, and it takes a while to do that. So it would probably be at that time, and if we see that it doesn't pass, we start the budget preparation for the following year. That's probably a good time to start talking about where we're at and how we get there. One of the things, just to share with the committee, that we've been talking about at the staff level is also looking at spending some time on the technology side and trying to figure out what a future might look like, that we would maybe bring some options back to you guys as the board, so that right now I think on the technology side we don't know what it is, so we haven't factored it in. So one of the thoughts that staff has is to bring stuff, well, what if it was this? Let's start out with the answer you might want and kind of work backwards. And so we hope to do that this next year, sometime through Transportation, Regional Planning Committee, Public Safety Committee, Borders Committee, and hopefully get the board to a point where if we pass or don't pass in November, that we got hopefully a good plan to move forward.
So as for your other questions, you're just wanting to see those in the March presentation? Well noted.
All right.
Yeah, I just have a question. At the end there, all of the substance abuse monitoring, youth evaluation, juvenile delinquency, law enforcement, is that all paid for through, how is that paid for? Are there grants? And I didn't realize we were doing
this type of stuff.
Do you want to answer it?
Sure. I mean, Criminal Justice Division and Dr. Burke is here to go into further detail.
I don't need that, I just want to know.
Yeah.
Councilmember, I think primarily, Argus and that work criminal justice, either it gets funded in one of two ways. It's either through the member assessments that come into the JPA, so that's one of the ways, and then it's through grants. So
Okay,
it's
so all of the criminal justice stuff is funded through, I know, but all of that is part of Argus?
Criminal justice is separate than Argus, but it's all part of the public safety piece that we do here. And so criminal justice does work closely with Argus, but most of their work is pretty much grant funded.
Okay, so none of the Transnet funding for transportation goes into any of that?
No.
Okay. All right, thanks.
But where we do benefit is the data that comes out of that is used in a broader sense in terms of planning for the agency.
Todd? Todd?
Never mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the presentation. To forgive me, because I think some of us look at various budgets different, and MTS does it differently than the city does, whatever. With regard to this, I mean, it's unusual to see a draft or sort of preliminary budget discussion without a whole lot of numbers. There are two numbers that stuck out to me. One was that our sales tax revenue projections are below, actuals are below our projections. And that's for FY16. You're making a different assumption or lowering the assumption for 17. But what does that mean for this budget year? Are you making any reductions based on that shortfall?
We're seeing a lower rate, as you mentioned, and so we projected 5%. We're seeing somewhere closer to 3%. Andre, do you want to elaborate on that just a little bit?
Sure.
So like you mentioned, the numbers are coming closer to 3.5% for fiscal year 2016. So we are making adjustments for the 2016 budget, as well as going forward. We don't see the numbers necessarily any higher. So for 2017, we're also looking at 3.5%. And these are numbers that we discussed with the local agencies, with the county of San Diego, and then with our transit agencies to come up with the consensus. And obviously, based on what the actuals are coming, we feel comfortable lowering the numbers down from 5% to 3.5%.
So for FY16, with the 1.5% shortfall, what are the reductions you're making currently or planning to make?
Yeah, so those are actually one of the items that are going to go to the board of the Transportation Committee next week. We'll show the reductions of the actual amounts to all the jurisdictions. As far as Transnet, we're making the actual reductions to 3.5%. For TDA, because we have a fairly healthy reserve budget right now of 12%, we're going to go ahead and pay out the 5%, and then just kind of keep a close eye on it next year.
And you got to what was my next question about the reserve. So the high reserves, contingency reserves that are being carried in part is helping to carry that.
For the TDA.
For the TDA.
Correct.
Okay.
Let's make sure, because I think you may be confusing two different reserves. I think the reserve that Andre's talking about is the TDA reserve that we have.
The TDA fund is at the county.
And that's different than the TDA reserve that we have for the agency.
For the contingency, yeah.
Contingency reserve, I want to make sure we didn't mix this up.
Okay. When you say contingency, you're not talking about a project. You're talking about this is the organization's overall reserve account.
Yeah, so there's, like Gary said, there's two contingency funds that I'm talking about. One is a contingency account that sits here in Sandy, and that's for the overall OWP. Then there's a separate TDA portion that goes out to the cities and to the transit agencies, and that part sits with the county.
Okay.
Reserves there. So I'm talking about that second reserve fund.
Okay. And you're at, and the one that's here is the one that's at 31%.
Yes. Yes, correct.
Okay.
One other thing, Councilmember Gloria, if I can, so on the Transnet piece, sales tax piece really affects our operators, and that's where, combined with TDA and the reserves, that may help smooth that up, if we're lower. On the capital side, if the Transnet dollars come in at a lower level, that's why we have a plan of finance, and many of the projects we're working on the capital side are multi-year projects, they're big projects, and so coming up, the two biggies are Mid-Coast and the stuff we're doing on I-5 and the North Coast Corridor. So if those numbers come down in a given year, schedules maybe need to be adjusted, things may be, and so that we do that through the plan of finance where we come and we adjust that every year. So so we may need to make some adjustments to projects. And as an example, at the state level, we know now that their STIP funds, we're probably going to see a reduction. We don't know how much, probably in the magnitude of $30–40 million for the region. So then we'll adjust schedules, and that's when, looking at mirror bed, well, when's 78 coming? Well, then 78 may, or any other project that we got in the list may move out, given how we manage the cash in that year. But since the capital projects are multi-year, we try to address that through the plan of finance.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. Last question?
I'm glad to see that we're making adjustment early enough, because the dip in sales tax is substantial for our operation and for capital project as well. 3.5% for the rest of the year is still, we need to watch that closely, because the expectations are the economy with the silly season right now, it's not gonna do well between now and the end of the year. So I'm glad we're monitoring that and we're taking action early. And I'm glad to see the I-15 is generating more revenues for the budget. We're carrying the Sandak budget on our backs, So we're very happy to see that. There is a benefit of widening freeways, folks.
We know that.
Okay.
Okay. There's no action.
Mr. Chairman, on the sales tax, since the projections are lower than expected, I wonder if we could get a breakdown by jurisdiction of those sales tax revenues, each of the cities, the unincorporated area. I think that might be interesting to all of us.
You can provide that, yes.
Can you?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, with that, we're going to move ahead. So we've got a couple of items, we've got a couple of meetings to go through. So let's move on to item number 6, the audited comprehensive annual financial report.
Good morning, members of the committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With me today is Jennifer Farr. Jennifer is a partner with the independent certified public accounting firm of Davis Farr, who has recently concluded the annual audit of Sandak, including the audit of Sandak's comprehensive annual financial report for the CAFR for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2015. Copy of the CAFR is included as attachment 1. The CAFR provides the financial position and activity of Sandak and its 3 component units, the San Diego County Regional Transportation Commission, Sewers Point, and Argus. The auditors have issued an unmodified or clean opinion on these financial statements. The CAFR also includes the most recent award from the Government Finance Officers Association for the Certificate of Achievement for Excellence in Financial Reporting for its reporting CAFR. I think this is the 8th consecutive year Sandak received this award. With the 2015 CAFR, we believe we'll continue to meet the requirements of this program and have therefore submitted it to the GFOA to determine its eligibility for another certificate. And then we expect to hear positive results this summer. So now Jennifer will present the results of the audit and also communicate matters to the executive committee in accordance with statement of auditing standards.
Good morning, thank you for having me here today. We have completed the audit for the fiscal year ended June 30, 2015. We began our preliminary audit procedures in June and then returned in October and November to perform the substance of the audit test work. And then we recently came back in January to complete the single audit procedures and recently issued that report as well. Our report, the audit opinion and the report is dated December 14th, 2015, and it includes an unmodified opinion with an emphasis of a matter for the implementation of GASB 68, which is the new pension standard. With the implementation of this new pension standard, for the first time ever, your financial statements are reporting a net pension liability of the net amount is $33.7 million. The financial statements also include a much expanded footnote on the pension plan and the assumptions that go into calculating that liability. And you'll also note that there are 2 new schedules at the end of the footnotes that will eventually have 10 years worth of trend information on your pension contributions and your pension liability. So we're happy to report that the finance department was very prepared for the audit and the books were in excellent condition. We noted no material adjustments to the accounting records as a result of our audit procedures. During our audit, we also evaluate internal controls and compliance over certain laws and regulations, and we're happy to report that we had no material instances of non-compliance, no material weaknesses in internal controls, and no significant deficiencies in internal controls. I did want to point out that preparing for the audit, closing the year, and preparing the financial statements is a very time-consuming and difficult process for your staff. It's really says something a lot about the quality of your staff to not have any findings in this report, and I wanted to thank staff for their efforts during the audit process. So that concludes my prepared comments, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you, Jennifer. Do you have any questions, Mary?
I'm just curious
Mary,
about that. Just curious about that. The history little stuff in this audit, the topography, the demographics. I've never seen an audit having that stuff before. I'm just curious, is that something you always do?
The introductory section
Yeah,
of the financial statements, it's a component of the award program. So you can have financial statements without that information, but in order to get the award from a GFOA, that is a required element.
And how long have you been an auditor?
I believe it's about
The sixth. So the first 3 years is the first contract, and then this is the third year for the second contract. So this is the sixth year.
Okay, what's our policy on how long we maintain one auditor?
The contract is a 3-year contract with 1-year renewal, with 2 1-year renewals, so 5 years total.
So we're getting near the end of that.
For the second contract, the first contract with the firm is the same term, 3-year and a 1-year, 2-year renewal. But we didn't go to the renewal. We started the RFP, and then the same firm got chosen again. So the second contract, this is the 3rd year now.
Is it the same auditing team, or do we have a different auditing team with the same firm?
It's the same auditing.
You actually have a different firm and some of the same audit team members.
I prefer to have the same firm with different auditing team members at the end of a contract, and that's just my personal preference. I think we need to be aware that people can get too cozy with staff. And guys do a great job. I'm not complaining about it. I'm just saying auditing comes to us. We've got 5 minutes to look at it. It's a big audit. It's a wonderful audit. We need to make sure that everything is above board.
I want to point it out, the first 3 years, if you look at the SAS letters, we had lots of comments, lots of findings. We made a lot of corrections and improvements, so now where we are now.
I think it's wonderful. This is not an attack. It's just
Mayor, for
a
assessment,
policy perhaps we should look at.
if I can maybe try to help here, and look, after we didn't execute the 2 second-year options because we wanted to go back on the market to see, what firms are interested in doing this. And one of the things that government in general probably has to work at is that, there have not been lots of responses to come and audit. So that was one of the challenges in this, when we went back out, we basically found, the same firms that have been doing this work were the only ones that were responsive. So we probably got to work harder at trying to get, hopefully, more audit firms to be interested in this kind of work.
And again, I don't have a problem with the audit firm, but it can change their team. It's the individuals.
You want fresh eyes to.
Fresh eyes.
Yeah,
Fair enough.
Firm is fine.
maybe okay. Comment register.
Quickly about the pension liability, you mentioned that, and I think the policy, the board has decided to put more money in the 2% to start a little fund there to address the future liability. Even with that, we still have what's your recommendation about the pension? Should we do more?
We do still have a liability, it's not unusual.
Right.
I would say most California governments have a liability. So those decisions about funding policies are really outside the scope of the audit.
Okay?
What's the funded ratio?
It's about 73%. It's pretty high.
We need to work to get that higher. Yeah. Okay, one correction, you have more than 5 minutes to look at this. You can look at this for as long as you want.
Okay, I'm just watching the clock for the 9 o'clock start.
If you discover that you have a concern, I would really ask you to bring it back, because I don't want us to miss something. Okay. Thank you. We're going to now go to the review of the draft board agenda.
Yes, so for your February 26th board business meeting, it's quite a full agenda. Items 1 and 2 are for your standard approval of meeting minutes, public comments, communications, member comments, and actions from policy advisory committee. We have quite a long consent agenda. Item 4 is approval of proposed solicitations and contracts. We only expect to have one contract award in the on-call legal regulatory law category. Item 5, the Strategic Growth Council grant final report. We found that we can satisfy that administratively, and we don't need separate board approval, so we will propose to remove that from your agenda. Item 6, update to the 2016 State Transportation Improvement Program. Jerry mentioned the STIP changes at the statewide level, so this is going to Transportation Committee next week. We'd actually like to move this one off consent to reports to brief the full board on it. Item 7, we talked a little bit about this with regard to the Transnet revenue forecast. So this is the FY16 proposed revision to the FY16 Transnet revenues, and then projections for fiscal year 2017 to 2021. It's going to Transportation Committee next week and the board 2 weeks from now. Item 8, Transnet Active Transportation Grant Program proposed amendment to recommended project award for the 3rd cycle of grant funding. This is also going to Transportation Committee next week. This is the case where one of the projects funded by the Transit Active Transportation Grant Program in National City did receive was successful in competing for statewide funding for that same project. So what staff proposes to do is just go down the list of in your own Transit Active Transportation Program and move towards the next projects, unfunded projects on the list. So it'll be going to Transportation Committee next week. Item 9 is the annual update to the Transnet Regional Transportation Congestion Improvement Program. This is the fee on residential units in the city, and so the proposal is to increase that by the minimum 2% that's required by the ordinance. Item 10 is an amendment to the South Bay BRT addendum to the final environmental impact report. There were some minor changes with regard to an intersection in Chula Vista that we need to adopt an addendum, have the board adopt an addendum to that. Item 11 is the Transit EMP annual status report. This went to both Transportation and Regional Planning Committee last week. It's just a good news story. Item 12 is the FY 2015 audited capital, which you just heard today. We can bring that to the board on February 26th meeting. And then items 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17 are your annual appointment of Policy Advisory Committee members. So that would include information of all who the sub-regions appointed to the 5 policy advisory committees, as well as the proposed chairs and vice chairs appointed by the SANDAC chair. 14 is your overview of quarterly overview of financial markets and finance report. 15 is the quarterly progress report on transportation projects. And 16 and 17 are your standard monthly reports on meetings and events attended on behalf of SANDAG, and reports summarizing delegated actions taken by the executive director. We'd also like to add an additional item to consent. This is for the cap and trade, the low carbon transit operations program. $375,000 in funding has become available. We propose to use that for the South Bay BRT project, but we actually, to accept the funds, we need the board to adopt a resolution to provide to the state on that. So moving to reports, We have the EMP program again. This is the land management grant program, proposed changes in the call for project and cycle grant funding. They went to go through transportation and regional planning committees last week. Item 19 went to regional planning last week. This is the San Diego Regional Alternative Fuel Readiness Plan, so we'd like to bring that item to the board to accept the final report. And then items 20 and 21 are both related to the state's cap and trade funding programs. The first is for the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program. We're proposing to basically be able to submit projects, some of our active transportation projects, and possibly in conjunction with some of the local housing projects to be a little bit more competitive for that grant program. Item 21 is the Cap and Trade Transit and Intercity Rail Capital Program. Again, there's funding available statewide. We're proposing some projects in your Transit Early Action Program, in particular coastal rail projects along the Roseanne corridor. So that'll be going to Transportation Committee next Friday. And then we have the hearing of necessity with relation to Mid-Coast, both bringing back properties you heard last month, as well as some new properties in the corridor that we'd like the board to consider adopting the resolutions of necessity for. We have 2 closed session items right now, and then are proposing to add 2 additional ones. Item 23 is one related to a vehicle fatality that occurred on the State Route 125 last year. Item 24 is a claim by a commercial property owner at 11th and Broadway in relation to construction of the downtown rapid stations project, claiming business disruption. So we'd like to bring that one. And then the 2 we'd like to add is a claim we received from Tucker Sadler Architects, who was a subconsultant to Parsons Brinkerhoff, and their claim is stemming from the work that they did on Mid-Coast in conjunction with Parsons Brinkerhoff. We'd also like to add a brief closed session just to update the board on the beach sand litigation, including the results of the recent mediation that occurred last month. So with that, then the remaining items are continued public comments, and your next meeting after that will be your board retreat, and then finally it's just adjournment. It's pretty full.
Thank you. With that, I think we've completed the meeting of the public.
As a next, yeah.
We need a motion. We have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying, you got the machines, we can vote. Voting is closed. And that passes unanimously. With that, do we have any requests for public comment? We don't. And the next meeting,
Retreat agenda.
retreat agenda.
Yeah.
Should do a quick.
I can be quick. So morning. So at your Board of Directors retreat from March 9th to the 11th, it'll be at a Verona Resort. You'll start with a welcome by Chairman La Chapa, followed by our first session on the new federal freight program that was just passed. You'll be looking at funds that are on the table and what we can use those for in projects here in San Diego. Our next session has to do with energy and the future of energy. We'll have a speaker from SDG&E and another one from UC San Diego, looking at exploring new and emerging technologies, deploying electric vehicle charging stations, and renewable energy. Thursday morning starts off with a Transnet story, looking at the interactive Transnet story map that we've developed and how you can use it in your jurisdictions. Then we'll have a session on the priorities and another summary of the outreach that we've been conducting for the expenditure plan, followed by a session of asking stakeholders' perspectives on what their priorities are for the expenditure plan and a funding measure. So we've invited someone from environment, business, the Quality of Life Coalition, labor, and water to provide their insights for you as the board to consider as you're developing that expenditure plan and a possible funding measure. Our next session has to do with the potential ballot measure itself. This is a time certain one. This is one that we've been promoting to the public to come and weigh in if they have opportunity, and for you to have a deeper dive into the draft expenditure plan that you'll be discussing later this morning. During lunch, we'll have a speaker, Denny Zane. He's the Executive Director of LA Move. He has successfully helped to pass a number of transportation funding measures that help transit in the Los Angeles area, so we'll get some insight and perspective from him. After lunch, you'll have a tiny bit of a break, and then we'll jump right into the regional plan projects and looking at what projects could be in jeopardy if a funding measure is not passed. That will be followed by a dynamic speaker, Ken Grombach. He is a demographer, internationally known. We've been very fortunate to be able to get him, and he'll provide his insight. We will have a dinner speaker. We are trying to still secure that, so I will update you as soon as that becomes available. Friday morning, we start off with our Sandag Executive Committee meeting. Will be held out at the retreat. That will be followed by your favorite Mike Madrid coming back again for a third time. This time he's looking at all of the ballot measures that could be on the ballot that might compete with a funding measure if you decide to put one on, and what that might mean for that funding measure. And then we'll have an amazing speaker, Richard Anderson. He was on the show Undercover Boss, but more importantly, just some really important tips that he has learned to be a successful leader, and that will conclude. Interspersed in there is opportunity for public comment.
Thank you, Bill. You did it very quickly. A lot. We're going to mix some things that I think you're going to really enjoy. The speakers, we've got at least a couple that are really terrific. Very, very good. And the one that she mentioned, I don't want to say too much about him, but I saw his presentation in San Francisco. He's fantastic. So we've got really, there's going to be a lot of work though. We've got to figure out what we're doing on the initiative, and our final decision will be made subsequent to these meetings, but this is going to be very important. I hope all of you will be there and participate.
Mr. Chairman, I think the council suggested.
Because that's a board meeting, ultimately it's your role to approve that agenda. If you could do a quick vote on that.
Okay.
Move.
There's a motion and a second over here on my left. Please vote. Just to approve the agenda. It's an official meeting.
Can we bring it up?
Why don't we just,
Let's
have a voice vote, please. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, hearing none, I'll deem that
And if
unanimously
I can
approved.
encourage everyone, if you have not RSVP'd, please do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, have a good day.